Okay, looks like we are ready to go. Hello to everybody that's just joined. This afternoon, we're going to be hosting a webinar on the national movement to create little forests. Little forests, also known as mini forests, among other names, are native tree and shrub communities planted tightly together based on the Miyawaki method. These forests provide critical green space in urban and suburban environments, reduce air pollution and urban heat island effects, increase biodiversity, and much more, as you're going to learn today. As a final reminder, if anyone would like to tune in French, please just click on the interpretation icon at the bottom and select French from there.
Et donc, je rappelle que si vous souhaitez écouter ce webinaire en français, veuillez cliquer sur l'icône interprétation en bas de votre écran et sélectionner le français.
So before we get into the content, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land that we're seated on. We acknowledge that the land that we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I know we're participating today from all across Canada, so as always, I invite you to reflect on the land that you are on. Today, we're delighted to have three wonderful speakers that are involved in the movement to create little forests, including Joyce Hostyn of Little Forests Kingston, who I don't see as a panelist yet, so we may have to just switch up the order. Just bear with us, but hoping she'll join shortly. Emily Amon of Green Communities Canada, and Shawn Murdy of the Toronto Zoo. So I'm going to introduce everybody. Joyce Hostyn is a Rewilder who dreams of city streets lined with fruit and nut trees, wild parks, and wild yards. Raised on a farm where her family grew, foraged, and preserved enough produce to last the year, Joyce is now exploring what it means to be in conversation with the forest garden on her lawn-free quarter-acre lot. A master gardener and permaculture designer, Joyce coaches people on foodscaping and wildscaping as a new approach to gardening in a changing climate. She helped design and plant Kingston's first two public food forests, is co-founder of Little Forests Kingston, and now has her sights set on afforesting the city with Indigenous little forests. Emily Amon is the Director of Green Infrastructure at Green Communities Canada. She's been leading environmental programming through GCC for the last 4 years, including the Depave Paradise program, in which volunteers come together to rip up asphalt and replace it with native planted green spaces. In 2023, GCC launched a national mini forest pilot project in partnership with the Network of Nature to help communities address lacking canopy cover, sequester carbon, and reduce heat island effects while meeting Canada's national target of planting 2 billion trees. Emily is a proud Trent University alumni with an honors bachelor degree in environmental sciences and studies and a Master of Arts in sustainability studies. She currently lives in a little cabin and is living out her homestead dreams in the Cowichan Valley, Vancouver Island, BC. Shawn Murdy is the Supervisor of Horticulture at the Toronto Zoo. As a passionate horticulturalist, he has a love for creating landscapes with native plants and protecting spaces where native species thrive. In his role with the Toronto Zoo, he works with a passionate team to create wild spaces that support pollinators and wildlife, both flora and fauna. In protecting these native spaces, he has dedicated time to the removal of invasive species and educating others. With a studied love for flora, he understands the impact plants have on our local environment. Sharing that passion and knowledge is what he loves to do on a daily basis. He engages regularly in community events, educating others on the importance of preserving native biodiversity and working to conserve nature's beauty. He grew up in Toronto, where he discovered a love for the outdoors, exploring natural spaces and waterways. Outside of work, you can find him playing and coaching local sports, fishing with the son, or even tending to his own garden. So that covers my introductions. I expect we'll have some time at the end for questions. So if you have any, please type them in the Q&A at the bottom, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. And I see that we don't yet have Joyce with us, so we're going to start with Emily and then see after that. So With that, I'll turn it over to Emily to kick us off.
Can everyone see my screen all right?
Looks great.
Perfect. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everyone for having me. Thank you for hosting this wonderful webinar. I'm excited to share a little bit about our national mini forest pilot and some of the work that we've been doing this past year. As you heard in the introduction, my name is Emily Amon, and I'm the Director of Green Infrastructure at Green Communities Canada. And I join you today from unceded Cowichan Tribes territories on Vancouver Island. This past year, we've been funded by NRCan's 2 Billion Tree Program to launch a national mini forest pilot. This project has been a collaborative team project connected with an initiative of Canadian Geographic called the Network of Nature. So amongst this team is Green Communities Canada, who is focused on delivering ongoing training and coordination support for community organizations and municipalities that are taking on these projects. Canadian Geographic has been a leader in supporting our communications and amplification of this project. Dugan and Associates has been subject matter experts and have really helped to support all of the training development that we've done this past year. And Rewilder Climate Solutions joined partway through the project to support the development of newly produced video assets that will be launched in the following year. So a little bit about Green Communities Canada. We connect community-based climate action groups through a national network to share resources, co-create innovative programs, and elevate our collective impact. What this really looks like is multi-community programming, as well as funding and all kinds of project management supports for local organizations working on this together. And then we report collectively and are able to really show great collective impact from this work. So just a little spotlight on the Deep Paved Paradise program that was mentioned in my bio. This project has taken place for the last 10 years, and we had 80 projects completed with more than 4,000 volunteers and 64 site hosts all across the country. This program is basically the model that we used for developing our mini forest national pilot. So through the Deep Pave project, we had, online coordinator training, a community of support that was developed for monthly meetings where coordinators all across the country could meet and chat about their projects, as well as study funding to support the implementation of these sites, where communities would come together, break up asphalt, make a big splash, and replace it with native planted green spaces that transform their communities and create lasting change into the future. So Dugan and Associates originally came to us with this idea. They wanted to see these projects happening all across the country, and after seeing our Deep Pave model, thought that we, would be a good candidate for supporting a scale up of this mini forest concept. And we were totally on board. Just a little bit of background for folks who don't have it. Mini forest sites are designed and planted in a strategy that's inspired by the Miyawaki forest method of afforestation. Dr. Akira Miyawaki developed this concept in the 70s of planting really dense stands of trees closely together in ways that mimic nature. And so in these dense plantings, the trees compete for canopy cover, and they grow faster and they grow up instead of out. And so in this way, we're able to put more trees in smaller plots, and sequester more carbon more quickly. So there's many different environmental benefits from planting mini forests. From increasing biodiversity, these sites usually have, upwards of 10 different tree species, as well as shrubs and ground covers. They're very fast growing. They offer opportunities for stormwater infiltration. They can support urban cooling. They tend to be fairly low maintenance after the first year. They sequester carbon. Of course, they're increasing green space, and particularly we try to focus our efforts in areas where green space is needed most, so equity-deserving groups or areas of higher climate vulnerability. Often these two are linked. And also they help to improve mental health and grow and deepen our connections with nature. So some of the characteristics of mini forests include that they are always native planted. They have diverse species amongst 3 different canopy layers. So you've got the canopy, subcanopy, and ground cover layers. They are densely spaced, so typically a minimum of 3 stems per meter squared. The site is prepared ahead of time using soil amendments and could be deeply dug. Up to a meter of excavation is sometimes recommended, and amended with compost and mycorrhizal inoculants. They have been shown across the world to have an altered growth rate and pattern. So as I was saying, like a faster growth rate or growing upwards instead of outwards, and that they're really well suited to urban sites. It's good to note at this time that these sites don't produce a traditional forest ecosystem. And our recommendations aren't necessarily that this should be used in a restoration context, but certainly within urban sites where we are aiming to increase canopy cover and put more trees in the ground. This is a really fantastic strategy for increasing our green spaces quite rapidly. So some of the considerations that a community organization or a municipality, anyone who's wanting to develop a mini forest site might want to consider are the ownership of the site. So is it public or publicly accessible? That's been a priority within our program, that they are, accessible for maintenance, and that there is potential for a support within the community to steward the site and help to maintain and monitor it into the future. Our size minimums are 100 meters squared to be afforested with at least 300 trees. These should be sites that don't necessarily need to be walked through because, as I described, they become quite dense. We want to look at the site history so that there's, low risk of contamination. And for this past year, the priority was also that they would be able to be planted by fall of 2023. And that there are beneficiaries in the area so that the folks that are going to receive the greatest benefits from these areas are folks of high environmental need, so adjacent to underserved communities or in areas of higher climate vulnerability, and that we are able to install some permanent signage or educational signage to help amplify these projects and continue to sort of ripple out the benefits into the future. So our objectives for this year included, this was a capacity building grant, so it was all about laying the groundwork for this program so that it could be expanded into the future. So we were aiming to develop the tools to equip community organizations and municipalities with knowledge and skills to be able to implement these projects. We wanted to obviously mobilize some volunteers to plant these mini forest sites. And we also really wanted to make a splash and engage local media and community stakeholders to help grow the movement and see if it would catch on in other communities. So the support that Green Communities Canada offered to those local partner organizations who were actually planning their sites included funding, so grants or micro grants of $10,000 to $15,000, which generally covers basically everything associated with the cost of the project. Of course, where landscape architects are involved and things like that, the prices can climb, but typically speaking, a 100-meter square site would fall within that range. Online coordinator training. So this past spring, we did a bunch of trainings online through Zoom and recorded them and put them up on a Google Drive so that everyone could have access. Mini forest site planning toolkits, templates, and resources. Technical support and guidance and coaching throughout their planning process, as well as monthly group meetings where we came together to support one another and check in on project progress, as well as troubleshoot or celebrate successes. So as I mentioned, there were core grants of about $10,000 per community within the municipally led projects, and this funding was provided by NRCan's 2 Billion Trees initiative. It was a capacity building grant in which we committed to 8 sites in 5 communities. But actually, it also coincided the timing with our launch of Green Communities Canada's Living Cities Fund. So this Living Cities Canada Fund was primarily funded by the Definity Insurance Foundation, with some support also from Greenbelt Foundation, Balsam Foundation, and All One Fund. And through that stream of our funding, we were able to support another 10 mini forest sites that were primarily led by community organizations. So our total number of sites for 2023, initially we thought it was just going to be 8 sites, but it's actually 18. And there are sites all across country in BC, Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. We'll work on getting some more prairie folks involved in future years. And so the total number of trees for this year is estimated to be 7,500 trees. And the total number of participants in terms of volunteers is expected to climb past 1,500. So our current progress, because this is a 1-year program, we have already planted 7 sites. So the first site was in Richmond, BC, and I'll share a little bit more about that project in a few moments. But just in the past few weeks, we've had projects go in Markham, led by City of Markham, led by City of Guelph. There was a project in the summer led by Rev in Quebec, in Sherbrooke, Quebec, and they actually did a combination of a depave project and then put in a mini forest, which was quite exciting. And yeah, just recently also in Georgetown, Ontario, at a local church, and in Calgary, Alberta, also at a faith center. Over the next few weeks, 11 more sites will be planted. These sites are going to take place in BC, Ontario, and Nova Scotia. And some of those sites include a decommissioned landfill, an Indigenous community center, a housing cooperative, a faith building, existing park space, a college, and a community arts center. And that's really exciting for us, especially thinking about, in terms of equity and ensuring that these projects are supporting communities that have traditionally been underserved. We also worked with, as I mentioned before, Wilder Climate Solutions to produce some high quality educational videos and develop some new mini forest branding. And so all of the tools and templates that we've developed this year will be launched in a more formalized process and platform, most likely on Teachable, where we house a number of our other online learning offerings. So just to, kind of look at some of the tools that we developed this year. So we have a really robust training curriculum. We have baseline species lists for all of the forest regions in Canada. We have created communication supports, so media release templates, video and photo shot lists, talking points if you have media engagement at your events, etc. We have site host agreement templates. So if the community organization or the organization coordinating the event doesn't own the location, we have templates to help negotiate and coordinate those relationships with the person who does own or the entity that does own that land. Monitoring and maintenance guidelines and protocols as well as a template for the monitoring and maintenance plans, because it's important that these sites not just go in, but also be monitored into the future to see their success. Templates to develop signage, a site preparation guide, so identifying what the best strategy is for amending that soil, and what the best strategy would be based off of what you're seeing there. Project management templates, so like event sequences, training videos, and of course, our monthly community of practice. So I wanted to take just a few moments to share a little bit about our launch event, which took place in Richmond, BC on Earth Day this past year, partially because I was there, so I can speak to it quite well. This was a really fantastic event. The partners, so this project was led primarily by the City of Richmond, but with great support from Garden City Conservation Society, who's a local not-for-profit there. We supported also through our training and our templates and etc. And Dugan and Associates offered technical advice, while Canadian Geographic helped to support the communications about the event and develop media releases, etc. So the site in question was Terra Nova Rural Park. This is a sort of coastal park in Richmond, BC. The area in question was a passive recreation zone, and it was just maintained as a meadow previous to this. So this is sort of like a big, wide field, sort of in the lead up to a trail, which had just been grass. The site itself was about 150 meters squared, and the soil on the site was a thick clay soil. So it was prepared actually by doing a full 1 meter excavation and amending with leaf litter, mycorrhizae, and compost. And all on the day of planting, 180 trees, 365 shrubs, and 180 ground covers were planted at a density of about 5 stems per meter squared. And you can see in this photo what that grouping kind of looks like. So all around the site, there were clusters of trees already set up, and then volunteers would come and work together to plant them. So on the planting day, there was over 100 volunteers, which included families and park staff and lots of VIPs. So we had like some of the city's representatives there. Some representatives from Natural Resources Canada were there, the mayor, etc. And it was just really only about 2 hours, but over 700 plants were installed, which was quite amazing. And you can see lots of kids were getting in on the fun. And it was pretty mucky, even though it was the soil had been amended, there was a lot of clay up right at the surface. So it was good that a lot of folks were wearing those muck boots. So in terms of follow-up, there's now permanent signage at the site, which provides that lasting educational interpretive benefit. Garden City Conservation Society has taken on the stewardship role for this site. So they're monitoring for invasive species, tree mortality, biodiversity, and tree growth, as well as providing some seasonal weeding and watering and mulching. And the city has actually been so pleased with the site that there are plans to expand the planting area this fall and double the size of the mini forest. So that's a really wonderful outcome for us. The mini forest movement is growing. You wouldn't be here on this call if you weren't at least a little bit interested in what the heck is going on. And so through our outreach and engagement this past year, we've identified 28 shovel-ready sites for 2024 among 20 partners across the country, and have worked together to apply for some funding to make that happen. We have total planting goals of 15,000 trees for the next year, and those partners include community organizations, municipalities, and institutions. The sites include community housing locations, senior centers, community centers, faith buildings, parks, and more. Here's some other ideal mini forest sites just to get the imagination going. So mini forests could border roadways. They could be located at schoolyards and parks. I would love to see them in power line corridors where that's appropriate. adjacent or at the edge of sports fields, in old lots, parking lots, and street medians. And I'm sure that there will be lots more creative ideas that come up in the future. I wanted to highlight just for a moment, because I know we have quite a few municipal representatives or folks who work for municipalities on this call, that municipalities really do have a significant role to play within all of this. We've been really lucky to have some leadership within our mini forest pilot from the city of Guelph, the city of Markham, the city of Hamilton, and the city of Richmond, as well as the city of Toronto, in terms of leading their own mini forest sites. But even where the municipality is not the lead on the project, municipalities can provide access to land, matching funds, materials such as trees or mulch to really help enable community organizations to do this work. They can also help to make, approval processes more quick for those community organizations if they really understand the process and are behind it and help to advocate on their behalf. Another way that municipalities can help is by conducting some research or working together with community organizations to conduct research and share success stories so that these projects can continue to grow all across the country. So for us, our next steps, we'd like to see everyone get involved, whether it's in the role of being a coordinator of a local mini forest at a school near your home, or as a site host, if you're somebody who owns land, if you have access to funding, or are somebody who grows plants, or even if you just want to be a volunteer on the day of the planting, or continue on in a more formalized forest steward role. I think it's really amazing to see how many people are inspired by these projects. And for us, it's not just about putting in the forest and seeing that transformation, but it's really about changing hearts and minds and seeing, how beautiful these transformations really can be, and feeling that empowerment that climate change is not a foregone conclusion, and we can work together to make our environments more green and healthier for ourselves, but also for all of our more than human kin around ourselves. In terms of our Network of Nature collaborative, we are trying to continue to amplify the project from this past year. So we are hosting a conference in October that's hosted by Canadian Geographic in Ottawa. If you're interested in learning more about that, I can pop my email in the chat and you can connect with me. We also, as I mentioned, have some new online educational tools and branding launching in the fall. And we'll be very excited to share that more widely when that's available. And we'll also be putting together a bit of an impact report this winter. So that's all from me. Thank you all so much for your attention, and I'll pass it on to Joyce.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm actually going to give a shout out to Emily and Green Communities Canada too, because the biggest of the little forests that we're planting this year were funded thanks to the Living Cities Fund of Green Communities Canada. Robin Wall Kimmer, if you haven't read her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, a really wonderful book, she shares a teaching about the grammar of animacy, and this is what she has to say. A bay is a noun only if water is dead. When bay is a noun, it is defined by humans, trapped between its shores and contained by the word. But the verb wikwegama, to be a bay, releases the water from bondage and lets it live. To be a bay holds the wonder that, for this moment, the living water has decided to shelter itself between these shores, conversing with cedar roots and a flock of baby mergansers. Because it could do otherwise, become a stream, or an ocean, or a waterfall. Robert McFarlane, I love his definition of biodiversity. And one of the teaching that he shares, he wrote a book called The Lost Words, and he wrote that book because the Oxford English Dictionary for Children decided that the words from the natural world weren't relevant and took out words like wren, acorn, willow, and replace them with words that they thought were more important, such as copy and paste. This is the loss of magic that we've been experiencing in our cities. We're in what Rebecca Solnit calls a storytelling crisis, hemmed in by stories that prevent us from seeing or believing in or acting on the possibilities for change. And that's the kind of story that McFarlane was talking about in his Lost Words book. And it's the story of humans being on top and removed or separate from nature. And what this has led to is our climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. If you haven't heard, our insect populations are crashing, and that's one of the reasons our bird populations are crashing. We must, the elders say, reconcile with the earth itself. This was in the Truth and Reconciliation, and Saturday is actually the third now National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. And by planting a little forest, this is one of the really important acts of reconciliation that we can do with the land and start seeing ourselves as part of a concentric ecology where we are all related. Humans aren't on top. Humans are just one of many related species. We're in relationship. So we see planting a little forest as helping to halt and reverse the biodiversity decline that is still happening. And the goal is to halt it by 2030. So we are still declining in biodiversity. I'm hoping Kingston, and it's in the Kingston Strategic Plan, will be signing on to the Montreal Pledge to protect 30% of land, water, and ocean by 2030. Harold R. Johnson, in The Power of Story, a fabulous book I highly recommend, says, imagine love so immense that a mere human is incapable of enduring it all. You are plugged into the neural networks, the mycelia, the root systems of the forest. You experience and can translate energy and frequencies. You are repeatedly told by the spirits of the plants and animals and insects, you are a beautiful human being. So Western science, and Emily described the Miyawaki method, so I'm not going to go into it, but that's the Western science and the technology, the head and the hands of what we can be doing. The heart, though, I think the heart comes from the indigenous ways of knowing what in this 1994 statement is called the native spirituality that will guide the head and hands and help us do it in a good way, in a relational way. So Joanne Whitfield, the co-founder of Little Forests at Kingston, says, what will make planting Little Forests in Kingston different is our infusion of indigenous ways of knowing. Planting a little forest is a direct act of decolonization, the embodiment of the land acknowledgement. We are coming into relationship with the land and with the beings we support as we regenerate forests. Maureen Buchanan, another co-founder, she'd be teaching, and I actually don't see her in this picture, but she is in here somewhere. She is giving a teaching to a group of young students who came out in the fall of 2021 to protect the little forest that was planted there, 900 trees and shrubs in 300 square meters for that first winter. She says trees are our oldest elders. We have so much to learn from the trees. So now imagine that it's 2030. Imagine that we have started to shift, or we have shifted the story in which we're living. There is a new term called imagination activists. Imagine that we are all imagination activists. And Youth Imagine the Future is a festival that started last year in Kingston. And Jerry Jarrett has been going around Kingston and area teaching workshops, almost 3 a day right now. And the youth in last year, when they imagined the future, you can see some of the murals on the right, and they're green, they're not gray. The stories are much different than the stories that we are living now. And that in the background was the education note of Little Forest Kingston with Joanne and Nathan and Sylvie and others. They've been working on curriculum and working with schools around bringing this different way of knowing to the schools. So again, 2030, one of our goals is 300 tree equity. Imagine that every child can look out their window and see trees and the magic that they invite into the city. On even the hottest days, children can walk, wheel, or pick berries on green streets. Every child can experience magic in nearby green spaces. And this, see that handprint? Those are microbes, microorganisms on a hand. Someone shared this on Twitter and said why this was indication about why it's so important for children to wash their hands when they come indoors. Which really is like, no. This is an example of why it's so important to have biodiversity in the city, because those microorganisms are so important to human health, and especially the growth of the immune systems in children. There's a new type of ecologist called the microbial ecologist, and there's a new theory of called rewilding the urban microbiome, that humans, we've really increased our autoimmune disorders, anxiety, and other mental illnesses because of the lack of green space in our cities. The more we can bring back the multi-layered green spaces that little forests provide, the more we will improve our immune systems, our human health. So the biodiversity around us is linked to the biodiversities within our bodies. So let's imagine what a place where we park our car for an hour can become. So just here's a few possibilities. And this was done in France last year. The approach to a temple, and see how narrow the spaces on each side of the road, active transport routes in cities, streets. Just imagine all of them, those narrow spaces, becoming little forests. This is 14 years later. Here's a strip in front of a university in Utrecht in Netherlands who planted, last year it was over 100. I'm sure they planted a whole bunch more this year. This is the first year of that little forest. They call them tiny forests there. How about the front of an apartment building? And this is just a typical apartment building in Kingston. On the left is one in Seoul. On the right is one in Italy. Why can't we be doing this in front of our apartment buildings? How about a gas station? If they still exist in 2030, maybe they've turned into forests. Or a parking lot. This isn't quite a little forest, but it could be. Or it could be a less densely planted forest. A bank. The entrance of a strip mall. And again, these are more meadowy, but they could equally well be forests, or just a less dense forest. How about a front yard? And this was my front yard 30 years ago. I didn't plant most of this forest. This was planted by the birds and the squirrels. I actually ended up getting out of their way after my initial attempts at control. And this is effectively a little forest because the trees have grown up extremely densely, and even in this drought that we've been having, the forest is thriving and the house is so much cooler. Here's Kelsey, one of our fabulous little foresters here, and she organized and planted this little forest and Addictions and Mental Health Services next to their affordable housing complex last year. 690 trees and shrubs in that little forest, and their clients worked with her to make that happen. This is one-year-old one at the entrance to Big Sandy Bay, where they renovated the parking lot and planted this little Carolinian forest for species migration at the entrance. The Indigenous Food Sovereignty Garden in Highway 15. This is it. This is 1 year later, 2 years later, and we're planting another 900 trees and shrubs there this fall. So these are some of the forests, the work that we've done. In 2021 was when we planted our first 1,800 trees and shrubs. Last year we planted 1,490. This year we're planting approximately 3,000, the biggest planting being the one at the Cedar Center, which is supported by Green Communities Canada. And a shout out actually to City of Kingston as well, because they've really come on board and supported us with Little Forest. They really helped us break down the barriers at the senior center. That's the first Little Forest on public city land. And it's now in Kingston's strategic plan to look at little forests on public land. So Kingston is like doing some fabulous work in the area. And next year we have 3 sites already identified at Kingston Frontenac Corporation, which is affordable housing sites. And we're waiting to hear more about, we may have more sites in the works. Felipe Viveros Luis from Brazil asked, what can we do to support Indigenous people's efforts? He asked this of Indigenous elders in Brazil and received a clear answer: reforest the mind. Reforesting our minds is coming back into relationship with the living world we are part of, could hold the key to untangling the meta crisis. So one of the ways at Little Forest Kingston we'd like to think about it is we're helping the land remember by foresting the land, because this land was once forest. And the land at the same time is helping us remember, is foresting our minds, that we are all related, that we are all, part of the natural world. There's 10,000 years that the Indigenous peoples of this land have stewarded this land. And when we think of savanna, there's that very technical definition on the left, but isn't it a more fabulous definition? A collectively cared for food forest, a paradise. The oak savannas were designed forests, designed and enhanced entire landscapes, allowed a multitude of organisms thriving, not gardening, creating a paradise. This is Dr. Andrew Judge, an assistant professor of Anishinaabe Studies. They were showing the next 7 generations how much we cared about their well-being, and we can do it again. So planting for 7 generations, thinking of 7 generations. And Maureen Buchanan talks about 7 generations, not just of people, but 7 generations of the little creatures like the bees, 7 generations of all of the species. So little forests are collaborations between plants, soil, organisms, land, climate, geology, and people. Very collaborative. I'm not going to talk about the Miyawaki method because Emily's already done that, but really it's condensing natural succession down to 20 or 30 years. And that's what we're doing because all of our entwined crises are so critical. One thing, though, that is interesting that they are doing in Japan is they're planting them along shorelines, along waterways, around buildings to help protect against natural disasters such as fires, earthquakes, typhoons, and tsunamis, because they discovered after the big tsunami in Japan that the places that survived the best or with least damage were surrounded by native biodiverse forests. There is a multi-species movement happening around the world in academic circles. And Anna Singh, one of the anthropologists who's working on multi-species anthropology, says that landscapes, and I think about them as little forests, are multi-species gathering of ways of being in the making. And so as each community in Kingston works on and plants a little forest, comes and circles around a little forest, it's a multi-species gathering. Leroy Littlebear says the value of wholeness speaks to the totality of creations, the group as opposed to individuals, the forest as opposed to the individual trees. So a Miyawaki little forest is not about the survival of each tree, it's about who that forest wants to become. So some trees, they're not going to make it. Some trees, they're negotiating with each other. But the result will always be a forest that will thrive in that space. 3 seedlings per square meter, Emily mentioned, they could be in just about any configuration you can imagine. And we're planting all sorts of configurations with our little forests. I'm not going to go into the details of some of the studies that I've come across. If anybody's interested in some of these studies, I'm happy to share the links to the research papers. But on this one, you can see, and sometimes Miyawaki forests are quoted to be growing 10 times faster. I'm not, I haven't actually found any direct evidence around that, but there is a lot of evidence of the fact that biodiverse forests do grow faster, stronger, bigger. These are on the left, that you can see the difference in the growth of the same species of tree in a biodiverse forest versus a monoculture forest. They actually grow fatter, they grow they have more width to them. Robin Wall-Kimmer says the trees act not as individuals, so they don't know why this happens or how this happens, but somehow they're acting as a collective. Exactly how, we don't know. But we see the power of unity, of coming together. Cooperative processes, again, Western science is just starting to catch up to what Indigenous wisdom has known for so many thousands of years. But somehow the cooperative processes such as mutual shading, symbiotic nitrogen fixation, accelerated nutrient cycling, abundance and composition of mycorrhizae water interactions, light interactions, they all prevail over those competitive processes. So it's like we were taught in horticulture, you have to plant trees, a certain distance apart. This is not the case. This is not how we should be planting. And still, most cities, we've been doing it that way. And so as more cities adopt this method, we'll start seeing much more resilient forests. The biodiversity of the forest and the density of the green space also of the forest also has a huge impact on the cooling effect. And here's 3 different studies about just how much further that cooling effect happens, the reduction of the heat island, depending on the density and the biodiversity. They're also more reliable and stable at absorbing and storing carbon than plantations. And if you look at those images on the left and the right, one of the hints about why that might be is if you look at the root systems of the trees on the right and the diversity of the roots and the way they weave together in a network underground, and 45% of carbon is actually stored in the soil by roots. And so, yeah, another one. So little forests, we don't just plant forests, we circle community around a forest. So the first thing that has to emerge is a community of people who will help design and plant and care for, steward these forests. And Joanne, she's done a fabulous job of bringing multi-species collaboration into this thinking. And this is not the sheets that she's created because I didn't have a screenshot of them. But it's like, how do we start thinking about other species when we design these forests? And one of the ways is when we do our workshops, each person has a different species and they have a different human that they have to think about, not just about what they want, but what this other species like the fox may want, or the bee or a bird may want. And here's just the Kingston Frontenac Housing Corporation and how that emerges into a plan. And this one will be planted next year. And with Kelsey with her Addictions and Mental Health Little Forest, one of her clients, a number of her clients did designs, and this was just one of the designs that the clients came up with. The Senior Center, this is going to be our largest planting, and 3 little forests, a food forest, one in the little forest, a bird forest, a walking forest, because that's climate migration of Carolinian species, and a Great Lakes forest, which is the species that were already here. We're also working with people this year, just starting around what we call pocket forests, which aren't full 100 square meter little forests. They're either 3 square meters or 6 square meters. And we're offering 4 types of pocket forests, and we're probably planting around 20 of them this year as like a test and see how this works. But we found that this is really, really resonating with people. People are keen to take action and do something. And so look at this front yard and what it could become with a little forest. Here's a workshop that we just did as part of the Master Gardener Biodiverse Garden Weekend. And that's a pocket forest and one of the Kingston Frontenac Housing Corporation sites. And this has 12 different trees and shrubs. It's a keystone, what we call a keystone little pocket forest, because it has those keystone species. Douglas Ptolemy says that supports the most Lepidoptera, that's moth and butterfly caterpillars, which in then turn support the most birds. And you can see in the image on the left the difference that having these biodiverse native species makes versus the typical plantings that are done. What they have also found in in forests out after, I don't know, harvesting, whatever you call it, when they harvest trees out is that natural regeneration, there's tree islands and there's plantations, typical plantings, and these are much of what burned this year in Canada, are plantations of monoculture species. But natural regeneration versus tree islands, what they found is that tree islands are leaving small pockets of those forests there actually results in the best regeneration of the forest. They call this nucleation, and it's the birds and the bats and the squirrels that spread the species. One of the papers that I read recently is talking about how our cities could become, testing grounds for helping these species of trees migrate. We do know our cities will change, our forests will change. The trees don't have time, they can't migrate themselves. So in our cities, we could be planting these biodiverse and helping the species migrate. And then the birds and the squirrels can help spread them to nearby areas. John Sullivan in research in Brazil found that even small patches of native vegetation will be valuable as seed sources for accelerating native plant establishment in nearby receptive sites. I just found this leadership guide to building 15-minute cities. And in building 15-minute cities, one of the concepts is really that there is green space, and this goes to the 330-300 rule of thumb that I mentioned. And corridors, the ecological corridors, are so critical for the biodiversity and for species migration. And you can see in this building a 15-minute city, that image there, how there's really green corridors connecting everywhere. And what they've discovered, they used to say these small patches didn't really matter for biodiversity. Well, newer studies have shown that they're critical for biodiversity, and just by having them, the biodiversity keeps growing as species migrate along those corridors. So now, again, this is to conclude, we're back to 2030. Maureen, trees are medicine for children, children's are medicine for trees. And so this medicine has been happening for the last 7 years or the next 7 years. And this is a scenarios that were done from about urban forest design, and you see no policy change. That's what they are currently at the top left. The one that I imagine is habitat on the bottom left. Just imagine if that's where we go. So if a city was to be a verb, just like Robin Wall Kimmer at the very beginning said that a bay is a verb, to be a city might just help us imagine a new story, a 7-generation city. What we need now, Amitav Ghosh says, we need a vitalist mass movement, a collective work of beauty and art and human spirit and imagination, which may actually be magical enough to change hearts and minds across the world. So let's make magic, all of us together on this call, cities around Canada. Let's re-enchant our cities. Let's plant little forests of songs, poems, love letters to all our relations, and experience the wonder and delight of a deepening relationship with the land. And that's it. And I'm going to pass it now to our next speaker. Shawn.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Joyce. Yeah, some great information within there. And I appreciate Emily's delivery as well. There's all these practices have sort of come into play as we've engaged in our practices here at the Toronto Zoo. But first and foremost, I want to just acknowledge that I am on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit and Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Wendat people. We also border here the Rouge National Urban Park. And so that is a big component to our space, and conservation is always at the forefront with regards to our practices here at the Toronto Zoo. So I'm just going to bring up my screen here. And let me find my presentation. And can I just get confirmation that my screen's being displayed?
Yeah, we can see it.
That's great. Thank you, Joyce. Okay, well, at the Toronto Zoo here, we have had the luxury of being able to install 3 mini forests here over the past year. This was a collective of different people that had come together that started with the Canadian Geographic. We also mentioned Dugan and Associates, TD Friends of the Environment, all of which have come together to support this amongst many others. And I'll highlight a few of those groups that have contributed to our planting as I go through my slide deck here. When it came to our property, selecting a site was a key element. So, we have a big property here, as you can see. We have a lot of green space that could have housed our mini forest, but we definitely looked at spaces where this types of forest could succeed. We wanted to make sure it was accessible to the public. With regards to the public, we had to make sure that pedestrian pressures were eliminated. We're always building and improving on our infrastructure too, so we had to look at our long-term goals as to whether this space would be impacted, because this is going to be a lifelong installation, and we want to make sure that generations to come have the ability to enjoy this. And then snow removal on site is always a key component, so we had to consider that. And just overall exposure. We just wanted to make sure that this mini forest was at the forefront of our guest experience. We also wanted to make sure that it had the appropriate exposure to succeed. So when it came to our first site selection, we looked at our front parking lot. So our front parking lot, a large space with a lot of concrete. So we ended up identifying this space as a suitable location. So it's measured out at about 350 square meters. Within this space, you can tell a lot of, once again, infrastructure surrounding it, a lot of concrete surrounding it. So we had to have those discussions with the internal stakeholders here at the zoo, once again, to have conversation about construction, what might be going on in the future that might potentially disturb this. We had to identify services or locates that ran under here, ensuring that no major locates were within the space. So that's something everybody should pursue when coming to install mini forests, is get your utility, your one call provider on board so they can identify locates. Permits are also another key element there. We in this space here, we had all native trees with the exception of one. So we here on the Toronto Zoo property, we need to pursue permits for tree removal. So in this case, we did remove an invasive elm tree that had been planted decades ago. And then pursuing vendors, making sure our vendors were adequately sourced to provide us with the native plant material that we were searching out, and speaking with our soil amendment suppliers to ensure that they could bring us the proper amendments that we were looking for. When it came to preparing the site, we looked at how far in advance. Our first project came together extremely fast. I think we started discussing it in early September, and it was installed by Thanksgiving of that year. So, you're looking at how far in advance do you want to prepare for this site. So weed seed establishment, some practices can have you cultivating the land repeatedly to exhaust that seed bank. For our site here, we had to consider how messy was it going to get. As you can see, it's surrounded. This is the location here. It's surrounded by pedestrian walkways on either side. So we want to make sure there wasn't too big of a guest impact, or in your cases, maybe a park user impact. So we just had to keep that in mind. And then when it came to till or not to till, so I know some of the presentations here prior have discussed the amendment of soil, the removal of soil, but one of the things that we do look at here is the soil microbiology. So turning up that soil, aerating that soil is going to impact the soil microbiology, the mycelium, mycelium that and other fungi that might be in the soil. So we did make consideration for that. Weed growth, as I said, just allowing weeds to be turned over and cultivated to potentially exhaust that site once again and remove any vegetation that might be currently present. And then as this site is surrounded by concrete, we're looking at the fact that this space might be compacted. We know we were loading snow onto this space in the past. We know pedestrians, kids our guests are constantly engaging in the space in a positive way. So we had to consider how compacted was the soil. Ultimately, we did decide to do a light rototill of this space, and then that allowed to open up the soil a little bit for some additional moisture to enter the space and make for ease of planting when it came to our volunteers. This is just another angle of that site prior to preparation, so you can tell it's it's a site that it sees a lot of pressure from not only the public but with regards to the elements, being exposed to heat and serious drought-like conditions at times. So as I said, we actually stripped the sod. We stripped it with a sod stripper, and then we cultivated it, tilled it a little bit, and we added bark fines, which helps lower the pH of that space, also incorporates organic matter into the ground. And then we applied a layer of wood chip mulch on top of that at approximately 3 inches. So this is what the space looked like just prior to planting. Almost ready to go here, with the exception of the soil amendments, the bark fines, and the wood chip mulch to be added on top. Much like the other projects, as you've heard, we had some great cooperation, some great input from different supporters. So we had Canadian Geographic on board, Dugan and Associates, TD, Friends of the Environment Foundation, and the Toronto Zoo itself. So once again, we had signage here to display our intentions for the day. And once again, there's a bit of a look at what the site looked like in advance of planting. With regards to planting, we did all nursery stock that was planted in 1-gallon containers for this specific site. Much like Emily and Joyce were referring to, 3 plants per square meter is the target range there. You know, you could go a little bit heavier. There's no reason why you can't. We had a combination of large caliper trees, understory trees, and shrubs within that space. Herbaceous plants, and we did some research to ensure that it was all native to the area. So we did highlight that within a spreadsheet to ensure we had a bit of a balanced approach here. Once again, we don't expect all these species to survive, but the idea there is to install an educated, diverse amount of plant material to the space, with the intention of feeding the population. I saw something come up in the questions there about feeding wildlife, birds, and as you can see within our list here, we do have fruit-producing trees that will help some of those populations along. No planting event is without controversy and challenges, and as you can tell, this became a bit of a wet day. So this was in October, no more than about 2 weeks from now, so about the middle of October there. And we did experience hail on that particular day. So as you can see, it did litter our site with significant ice chunks. Just another shot of that. And then once everything was complete, this was sort of the finished product. This is actually a picture that I took this week of our mini forest planting. So all that 1-gallon stock has emerged. You can see some of the existing native trees are still flourishing, and I would say their health has actually improved in the past year. And the survival rate of this site is high right now. So we've only removed maybe a handful of dead trees and plants from this space. So we're looking at over 90% survival rate within the space, which is great considering the pressures that it does see. And so just another view of this, we actually installed a walking path for this space. So we want to encourage our guests to engage in these areas. So we ended up using a different colored mulch to highlight walking spaces. So it was left clear of any planting back in its original establishment. And then invasive species, we battle with that on site, and this is just a demonstration of that. We have Canada thistle here growing up amongst the plantation, so it does happen. We do have the luxury of having some labor here that can assist with. So invasive species will be managed, but we try to leave this as little with as little maintenance practices as possible. Invasive species, like I said, pedestrian pressures. There's garbage. We can see garbage in that picture as well. Watering on the at the beginning was part of the routine, but going into the winter, that's a time of year where overnight temperatures are more favorable for moisture retention. And then maintenance itself, like I said, is limited within this space. So considering, this was a picture that was taken just this week, and we provide very little maintenance to this site, you can tell that there's not many weeds overall developing within this space. Our second site was established this year, and we chose 2 new sites. So this, the one up the top there, is in our Africa savanna space of the zoo, and it's approximately 320 square meters. And then we had a lower site that this one here is more in a little bit of a wooded space at about 120 square meters. So like I said earlier, partnerships are always key elements. For our second planting, we had Simcor, a group locally here that's been a great contributor to this Toronto Zoo over the years when it comes to naturalization plantings. TD, Friends of the Environment, like I said, with our initial one last year. And then overall, just community engagement. So whether I was with the city of Guelph this past weekend installing their mini forest there, and just having the community come out, the volunteer groups engaged. I know the city of Guelph had great uptake there, where they had over 200 volunteers register for their event, and the same goes for ours. We had TD Friends of the Environment. We're able to bring out 2 rounds of volunteers. And then Simcor here had, as you can see in the background, had a great number of volunteers, and they were in the neighborhood of 200 people on site that day. So it was fantastic to have all those hands to assist with putting the plant material in the ground. Expertise is always a key component. So Heather Shibley of Dugan Associates there, working with that experienced team. So we had Canadian Geographic on board, which was a great promoter of our space. Dugan and Associates, Toronto Zoo staff, and again, local native plant nurseries. And as you can see, that day was also a wet day for us when it came to planting our second mini forest this past spring. And then again, with this site, adding amendments, we did bark fines. We actually transitioned a little bit here. We had surplus straw on site, so we used straw as a weed suppressant and moisture retention as well. And then there were some wood chips used to create those favorable weed suppression elements and moisture retention as well. So, and then here's an example of, or here's a picture of our newest mini forest. It's housed, we have an animal exhibit on the far left here, but it is surrounded by native sumacs. And then to the right hand side here is what we refer to our core woods, which is an established woodlot. So planting species that mimic our grounds here was the key element to plant selection. Okay. And I'm going to leave it at that. Jordan, I'll pass it back over to you. Thank you.
All right, awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Shawn, Emily, and Joyce, for the inspiring presentations. Also for all the work that you're doing to create little forests in Canada. I'm noticing that we're a little bit over time, so we're just going to skip the verbal Q&A. But I see that the speakers have responded to almost all of the questions already through the Q&A function. So thank you all for doing that so quickly. Really appreciate it. The webinar was recorded, so we've got it both in English and we've got our interpreter, Adrian, that was working hard in the background to do interpretation. So we're going to have that recorded and up on our YouTube channel as well. So I'll be sending out a follow-up email likely early next week with the link so anyone can rewatch. And that concludes the webinar. So thank you everyone for tuning in to learn about little forests. Hope that you all consider getting involved planting little forests locally. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful day and stay tuned for future Bee City webinars. Thank you.